Salutations, students. Today, Mr. Phillips and I are going to discuss to you the sort of intricacies, if you will, the ins and outs of public opinion and polling. If you on this slide, you'll see various definitions of public opinion. In this case, public opinion, if you just take the word itself, it's sort of giving you already an indication as to what it has to do with. In this case, we're looking at the opinions held by citizens which the government takes into account when trying to craft or draft policy. It's important to note here, however, that public opinion does not mean simply sampling any person in the public necessarily. If you'll notice, you could possibly run into people here who are simply visiting from another country. They may not be citizens of the country. And why I make that a point here is that the government is especially looking for opinions and feedback from people it is meant and designed to serve. And so if you're just happening to pass by or you have a connecting flight through the United States, that's not really who they're trying to sample or figure out their opinion when trying to create policy. So it's important to understand that public opinion, understanding that in this case specifically, we're talking about the opinions of people the government considers important to heed when they're trying to make policy. So keep that in mind as we move along. As you can see from this slide, there are various ways to understand the category of people who could be included in this term, the public. And who exactly is the public? Well, the reality is that most public opinion polls are going to have a sampling of all three of these categories. The masses will probably make up the majority in most cases. The issues surrounding that, however, will be that the masses, most people generally don't have that much interest in government or politics or know very little about government and politics. So the question follows whether or not it is always wise to heed the advice of those who may not know very much or be very well versed in the issues of the time. Now you'll see the terms elite and attentives, and you can read those terms for yourself, but essentially there are going to be some public opinion polls that will narrow the sampling of people they look at when trying to gauge public opinion. In other words, some polls will have a little a next to them, suggesting that all people were being sampled when they took that poll. Others will have things like RV or LV. RV stands for registered voters, and LV is likely voters. You could imagine that if you are in the likely voter category, you're probably going to have a higher sampling of elites and attentives, those people who tend to be very invested and involved in government. And there may be some rationale behind that, because these are the people who are most likely going to show up and vote. You can imagine politicians are going to be more responsive and reactive to what they have to say. There's also the thought process of the founding fathers, for example, who, if you recall, when drafting the Constitution, were a bit elitist in their approach in saying that really the people who should have the most say in government are those who own the most property, because in theory they would have the most at stake and would in theory make the best decision. Albeit one should note here that the founding fathers commented that way, and it was a system that was rather self-serving because they were the only ones who could in fact benefit from the fruits of their labor. But in this case, we could make some similar arguments, but it is worth noting that to some extent the government may be especially keen to hear the opinion of elites and attentives, since they are the ones who are most likely to turn out and vote.
Okay, like as Mr. Dava was saying, many of the people being surveyed in the public opinion poll, especially if you're surveying just general voters, all voters or all citizens, are going to have very little interest in public affairs. Therefore, it's going to be hard to know how to use that information. So with politicians, I think they take that into account, that especially if you're asking about questions such as, foreign policy or other complicated issues where most people don't have a lot of information, they're going to kind of take that with somewhat of a grain of salt, or they see that as an opportunity, as we'll talk about with our Socratic seminar for this unit, that they see that as an opportunity to maybe manipulate these people, manipulate public opinion to support the issues that they already support.
Now, I do want to sort of give the alternative narrative here, of course, is that, there is Rousseau. If you remember, Jean-Jacques Rousseau makes a very powerful and convincing argument that really the best person to make the best decision for oneself is in fact oneself. In other words, that no matter how much learning or, in theory, how much, experience one may have, that does not necessarily make you the best person to make the best decision, because we're all human, we're all capable of being corrupted and being moved by other interests than just the general public's interests. So there is definitely some need here to account for the masses' opinion, even though they may not be, say, as well versed in certain areas. They do maybe have a good sense for, a sort of common sense or intuitive idea of like what would be in their best interest. So we don't want to discount that, nor does the government, but you can imagine that there's definitely going to be somewhat a heavier reliance on those people who tend to come out and vote in terms of seeking their opinion. As we look at the public opinion polls and issues surrounding this topic, these are some important questions to ponder. When we're looking at the validity of these public opinion polls, we want to consider how reliable the information being gathered is. The way in which a question is formulated, or the methodology, that means the method by which the investigators gather information about this said topic, they can all influence the outcomes in a way that can bias your results. Also, who is in charge of creating policy ultimately, we want to consider. In other words, who are these public opinion polls speaking to, and who's using this information? How does the public opinion become policy? In other words, is there a really good link between what the public thinks and what the government actually creates in terms of policy? And we're going to show you some evidence that there is a troubling trend where there seems to be a very weak, tenuous at best, connection between what the public actually wants and what policy is passed by the government. And that perhaps should trouble some of us if we're, proponents of, a keener sense of what democracy is, or people having a say in their government and seeing that produced in results. But nonetheless, these are some questions to consider. To whom should the government listen? Is it really worth their time to listen to people who may not be as invested, or who have wiped their hands clean of trying to get involved? I think that there is also a very strong argument for always trying to make sure that your citizenry is engaged. After all, our founding fathers made quite a convincing sort of a case for making sure that our government had an informed citizenry, that the success of our government really depended on a citizenry that was involved.
Okay, so we're looking at different ways that we measure public opinion, and we'll look at how reliable are these various ways of measuring public opinion. Some people might think, oh, well, an election obviously is a great reflection of public opinion because people vote, and then the results of the election kind of tell us who they supported or what they were thinking. Think about a referendum where we show up and vote on an issue like whether to increase our taxes or pay for SPLOST, or if where a vote is put directly to the people. But then you got to ask yourself, is that really an accurate reflection of public opinion? And I suppose if you said, well, it could be, but is everybody really participating? And so we're going to look at some of the weaknesses of the various, elections, and is that really a good measure of public opinion? We also have different types of polling, like straw polls versus scientific polls. A straw poll would be, unscientific because it might be you walk up to, a table that's set up in the mall and they ask you to fill out a survey, or simply you place a survey on the internet, like say our friend Sean Hannity on Fox News, and he polls his viewers and asks them to, go online and answer a question. Is that really an accurate poll? We'd have, we'll look at why that's a problem with straw polls. And then scientific polling, which is the method that, will yield much more accurate results because you're using representative samples and random sampling, and we'll talk about all that stuff a little bit later.
So this cartoon just shows you some of the challenges faced by pollsters, because there is, and there's some evidence that supports this, that oftentimes when people are called by pollsters, that they don't always represent their true convictions, and they can be rather hostile to the pollster. It's a thankless job, as this cartoon is trying to portray.
And they say that, sometimes people actually, they've done some studies where if it's in person, you get a different result than if it's an anonymous survey on paper. For example, if you ask the question, did race play a factor in your vote for president in 2012, for instance, when Barack Obama was running, most people, or, if you simply were more direct and said, if you ask someone in a poll, are you racist? Then obviously people are going to be very likely to answer no. Perhaps if it was a written survey, or, do you hold racial biases, something like that, they're going to be a little more honest if it's just an anonymous box that they're checking on a piece of paper versus actually talking to another human being. And so I mentioned before, why are some of those polling methods, a couple slides back, why were some of those, not actually accurate? And the main thing, as I was hinting towards with my comments on elections, is that not everybody shows up. So if you have an election, a local referendum where you have 5 or 10% voter turnout, or even a presidential election where, for us, a high turnout is maybe around 60%, then, is that really an accurate representation of the country? And of course, the answer is no. And straw polls, again, are completely inaccurate, just kind of, they're mainly used for interest or for fun. You might, like I said, a poll, for instance, we said, like if you had a news show and you asked your viewers to go online, not only is that not accurate, it's you're going to have heavy bias if it was, say, a show with Sean Hannity, who's very conservative, versus if Rachel Maddow was surveying her viewers, and the question was, do you approve or disapprove of the President of the United States or something, even if, it's a typical question that might be asked, it's not going to be accurate. And people are choosing to participate, and that's the key. With scientific polls or with random sampling, the key is that everyone has to have an equal chance of being selected. And so when you do a scientific poll and when you survey people randomly, you're going to get much more accurate results. We still will talk about a margin of error. Even a scientific poll is going to have a margin of error. The best way to eliminate that would be to survey every single person that you're trying to, whose opinion you're trying to measure. But of course, that's very, very difficult when you're talking about measuring public opinion across the United States, or even at a statewide or local level.
It's worth noting here as well that with elections, in addition to the fact that many people choose not to go out and vote, that there are in fact barriers to people voting, even citizens who perhaps would like to. There are restrictions and limitations, and the United States has some of the most restrictive policies and limiting policies when it comes to voting. There are many other countries who make voting a lot easier, and there's a lot of discussion around why don't we make it more streamlined and simpler. And because in fact, our elections are increasingly representing not the majority's will, but this sort of select plurality of people. In fact, two very good examples is that within the last sort of couple decades, in 2000 and then again in 2016, in the presidential elections, in fact, the people, the public opinion, if you will, the popular vote, did not end up selecting who the president would be. And that would be a very, perfect example of how elections do not necessarily, even when we look at who came out to vote, will even show you where the people stand. And later on, we'll talk to you about, first past the post system, where it allows the candidate who gets the most votes, even if it's not even a majority, to win. And that could actually really distort people's impressions of what the people actually want. Also, with respect to scientific polls, you'll notice that there's a margin of error. You'll notice with polls, whenever you see the numbers plus or minus, they'll have a plus sign and then below it a minus sign, and next to it they'll have a number, and there's a plus or minus 2 or plus or minus 3, meaning that essentially the outcome of that particular poll could vary anywhere within the range. So if you had a candidate who got 48% and it was a margin of error of plus or minus 2, that actually could be, if you add 2 to that, that'd be 50. You subtract, it could be 46. So anywhere between the range of 50 to 46 could actually be what the sampling was showing you. So we have to keep that in mind in terms of trying to gauge the accuracy of a poll, because oftentimes people like to make predictions about who will win, and the polls are typically, in cases where we're going to watch them in the news, can be very close, and it's oftentimes more accurate to say that it's too close to call than to say, oh, well, this person's going to win by 2 points, especially if it's within the margin of error where the other person was at least within 2 points. Then you can certainly not predict with any certainty the outcome. Frankly, scientific polls, you're never really supposed to say with certitude. You can say there's a likelihood or a probability, but never with certitude.
Right, we saw that with the presidential election, of course. Most polls in the state-by-state polls, say in some of the states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and so forth, they had Hillary Clinton ahead in almost every poll, but it was maybe within the statistical margin of error. And of course, we saw in that case where Trump came out ahead in those states. This is just, this is telling you some of the reasons we might use, or some of the uses of scientific polls. Obviously, candidates for office are going to, as far as we're concerned, that's kind of our focus, is how does the government use polls? And as far as candidates, they may use it to kind of figure out where the public stands on a certain issue, or figure out what issues they need to be talking about. So it can be very useful for someone running for office or who's in office. Although, again, we'll talk, when we do our Socratic seminar, we're going to see that politicians don't necessarily always react to public opinion. They may be more interested in actually shaping public opinion. And, I think we saw that recently when the Republicans passed their health care reform bill, at least in the House, even though public opinion polls were showing it only had about maybe 20% approval from the public. So yet they still pushed it through, and almost pushed it through the Senate. And so maybe, I guess their hope might have been that, well, we'll get it passed and then we'll sell it to people, or, people will then get used to it, or, it's hard to explain. But they didn't really use public opinion to drive their voting patterns.
It's also worth noting that these 4 uses of scientific polls, you can imagine we are certainly going to be testing on these. But note that it says inform the public. Sometimes people's first impression of an issue comes from what the public is saying about it, and how someone formulates their opinion on an issue can certainly be driven by what they think the outcomes are, or what they think they see as being the majority's opinion about a particular topic or issue. So informing the public's important. It's a feedback loop for the public itself. It also can help inform people's first impressions. Obviously, candidates and office holders, Mr. Phillips already talked about that. and how there can also be a disconnect between what the public actually wants and what the office holders actually do. And again, we're going to see a lot of evidence, and this is something that a lot of political scientists are dedicating time and effort to, because a lot of people are under the impression, logically, that it would make sense that if the majority of people are really pushing for something, that that particular thing should then come to be and be made into law. We're going to see that there's really a sort of a wrinkle, or rather, if you will, a wrench in that kind of process. And it really doesn't come out that way as often as you would think. In fact, it's rather rare. And we'll explore the reasons why in Unit 3 more in depth. And then finally, of course, what Mr. Phillips and I and other politicos enjoy doing is using these polls to make some election night predictions. But we always need to be careful because, again, polls can be sometimes misleading, or they can be showing you something but not as strongly as you think it is showing you that particular outcome. In other words, always be mindful of the margin of error. So in this case, this slide is showing you the beginnings of public opinion polls. And in July 24th, 1824, we see the Harrisburg, Pennsylvanian, here in the capital of Pennsylvania, issue a report of a straw vote that was done in Wilmington, Delaware. And they did not bother to distinguish between a person's political party when they took this poll. They just asked the people who were in attendance to give their opinion as to who they would vote for between the candidates. And what's really interesting is you'll see here Andrew Jackson receives 335 votes winning the majority. And the outcome of this election is rather curious. In other words, perhaps this was somewhat foreboding. And Andrew Jackson, in fact, does receive the majority of the people's votes, but is unable to secure the necessary electoral votes to go on to win. Instead, John Quincy Adams manages to negotiate, if you will, with Mr. Clay, a situation where he could get his electoral votes and then go on to win. It was called the corrupt bargain, and you'll learn about that in U.S. history or in APUSH or HUSH whenever you're in either one of those particular U.S. history courses. But it was rather curious. In this case, the public opinion poll was rather telling, but couldn't obviously predict the final outcome. But that was due mostly in part due to some corruption.
And this is a famous instance where, again, a straw poll was kind of exposed for its weaknesses in its prediction strength as far as a presidential outcome. And the Literary Digest, kind of a cautionary tale of straw polling, where they had sent out postcards to their subscribers and some other people that they had lists of, and asked them who they were going to vote for president. And they had a winning streak of correctly predicting the results from 1920 through 1932. But in 1936, they famously made a mistake and predicted that Franklin Roosevelt would lose the election. Was that to Landon, or who was the Republican? I can't remember, but that Franklin Roosevelt would lose his bid for re-election, and of course they turned out to be way off in their prediction. So Roosevelt won re-election easily, and they usually point to several factors that played into that. And one was, you think about who would have been able to afford a luxury of having a magazine subscription back then during the heart of the Great Depression, and that would be more upper class and wealthy people. They also sent out the mailings in early September, which means possibly people could have changed their mind between that time and the actual election. And finally, that who's going to send back the survey? It's going to be people who are more self-motivated and people maybe who are more not necessarily representative of all the voters. And there's other things that aren't on the slide, such as they also drew, I think they had a list of people who had a phone and also who had purchased cars, I believe. And so that, again, they were oversampling significantly from upper class people who would be much more likely, then and now to vote Republican. And so, they or underrepresented the people who are maybe from the middle or lower economic classes.
Students often ask why then did they accurately, or how come they accurately predicted from 1920 to 1932? And I told them that if you think historically, the context in the 1920s, that was a period of time of great economic prosperity and boom, the 20s, the roaring 20s, if you will. So therefore, there would perhaps be less daylight, or if you will, difference between perhaps the policies that mattered, or the predictive abilities of the upper class in terms of being a proxy for where the rest of the country would be. Since things were on the up and up, you could imagine that the upper class and the middle class, for that matter, would have been on the same page in terms of keeping things as they were, especially as the economy was growing. When things took a decidedly turn for the worse in 1932, why perhaps it was predictive at that point was, again, it was such a catastrophe that any president who was in office overseeing, or rather in office during the catastrophe, was probably going to be booted out. And that would include, of course, the wealthy, who had suffered too during the stock market crash there, if you will. Their futures dimmed as well. And so, again, there could have been a tighter parallel, or rather connection, between the various classes. But by 1936, when we start to see things sort of maybe recovering a little bit, or we start to see the full-fledged policies of the Roosevelt administration, where perhaps the wealthy thought that they were not going to be enjoying as many advantages as they used to, we started to see a division between how the upper class or wealthy classes voted, and perhaps the middle and lower classes and how they voted.
And this George Gallup, kind of made a name for himself during this time because he correctly predicted the outcome of the 1936 presidential election. And so he gained a lot of notoriety, and sometimes called the father of modern day polling. He used a method called quota sampling, which we'll see is not actually, scientific as we would say today, but it was still, I guess, better than, what the Literary Digest was using.
If you can imagine, just take the word quota itself. Many of you have already come by this term in your prior social studies courses. Quota is a set limit, right? We usually talk about it when we're talking about trade, but you can think of it in a similar way here with polling. In this essence, what happens, let's imagine that the country is made up, is 70% white, 10% Hispanic, 10% black, and 10% Asian, right, for our purposes. And let's imagine then that Mr. Gallup was going to conduct a poll. What he would do was he would make sure, let's imagine the poll only included 10 people for the sake of simplicity here. 7 of those people would need to be white, 1 would need to be black, 1 would need to be Asian, and 1 would need to be Hispanic. In that sense, you would have an accurate representation of the various groups within the population. And so you would have met with that quota sampling. The problem with this method, however, is that you could imagine that even if you made up 10%, in this case, let's take Asians. Let's imagine they made up 10% of the population. Even if they made up 10% of the population, that does not mean that that's the amount of the population, or rather, that they will make up 10% of the voting population. In other words, we see that certain groups actually have very, very weak turnout when it comes to elections. So even though they make up 10% of the population, they may only make up 3% of the people who come out and vote. And so you saw that quota sampling had serious limitations. It also invited a lot of subjectivity, right? And to some extent, the investigators, or the persons conducting, if you will, the polling, would have to make predictions about who they thought was most likely to come out and vote, right, in what amounts. And that invites some level of subjectivity, and bias, which can certainly affect your outcomes.
And you also have to think about, just because you select, say, 7 white people, 1 African American, 1 Asian American, 1 Hispanic American, you're not necessarily, you still have to make sure you select randomly. And if he was just selecting people, who he happened to know, or, if you went to, let's say, you went to like a suburb of Atlanta and found, say, 7 white, 1 Hispanic, 1 African American, 1 Asian American, if you found those people in suburban Atlanta and surveyed them, is that really an accurate representation? Because if you just select them and it's not random, then there's a good chance there's going to be some bias there. And so, Gallup kind of fell from grace a bit in 1948 when he incorrectly predicted that Thomas Dewey would beat Harry Truman, it says here, by 5 to 15 percentage points, whereas Truman actually won by over 4 percentage points. And he realized that he had to recalibrate his polling methods and move more towards random sampling. And so he has recovered. Gallup is still a major poll that's used today, but it was an ongoing experiment.
It's worth noting that Gallup is typically considered the gold standard, or was at least for some time, in polling. Since then, plenty of other establishments have come up to rival Gallup. What is interesting in the last election, not this 2016, well, yes, 2016, but the prior one in 2012, Gallup had misgauged the outcome of the election, so much so that they actually took themselves out of predicting, if you will, who would win the presidential election for the 2016 election, in the effort to sort of recalibrate and gather once again to make sure that their polling was strengthened and more accurate.
That's just a famous picture of, Truman got a kick out of the prediction being wrong. Of course, he won the election. And I guess the Chicago Daily Tribune had already released some early editions where they went ahead and printed the headline, made that prediction that Dewey defeats Truman. Of course, that wasn't the case.
So we see new polling methods, as Mr. Phillips already mentioned, that one of the weaknesses of quota sampling was the fact that who was actually being sampled was not necessarily random. They just had to meet certain demographic criteria or other criteria. And again, you'll notice that with random sampling, and this is important, this is very important terminology. Please note this, right? In random sampling, it occurs when everyone in the population being surveyed has an equal chance to be sampled. That wording is important for you to internalize and understand. Again, random or probability sampling occurs when everyone in the population has an equal chance to be sampled. Okay, so this is important to note, and again, something that helps to remove the subjectivity bias, right, that you would encounter with quota sampling, where you're sort of inserting your own opinions about who you think would turn out. In this case, everyone has an equal chance. However, there is a flaw with this approach as well. While it does indeed eliminate some level of subjectivity and bias, if you oversample, in this case, you have no way to mitigate against oversampling a certain group. In theory, you could have a poll that only polled for, let's say, for a presidential election, only poll African American voters, for example. Well, clearly they're not going to be the only people who will be voting in the election, so that would give you a very inaccurate prediction. So while this polling method did indeed help alleviate or mitigate against the issue of bias to some extent, it introduced yet another problem where you could oversample certain groups of people.
It'd be like if you were trying to sample, opinion of high school students, and you only, even if you randomly sampled within Walton High School, or even within maybe Cobb County or East Cobb County, you would not, that would not be representative necessarily, right, of teenagers across the country, or high school students across the country. So even random sampling, as Mr. Dowell said, has its flaws.
And I mean to add, not just oversampling is an issue, but also undersampling, I think it should follow. So how is a scientific poll created? This is an important term, and I was going to introduce it to you before when we were talking about the random sampling, that everyone has an equal chance. And when we talk about the population that is targeted to be measured, that we will use in polling circles is defined as the universe. So get used to that term and that terminology, because it's something that's worthwhile, especially if you get into social science, to be familiar with. And you'll notice here that national polls typically require anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 respondents. In fact, I feel like nowadays that's actually a little higher. It's anywhere between like 2,000 to 3,000 that I've seen with national polls. So as, of course, the population gets, if you will, larger, that sampling size, in order to be accurate, will have to sort of increase as well. Now, why isn't it that they have, or they don't try to, put 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000? Well, that's a factor of, cost, frankly, and manpower. These polling businesses are businesses. They're in it to make a profit. And so they need to make sure that they balance the costs involved in, if you will, surveying people and hiring people to survey people and hiring the people who then tally up all the numbers and come out with these outcomes, with, the amount of revenue that they get, typically from candidates, office holders, the government, as well as news agencies or media outlets typically will pay polling services to get a gauge for where the people are on these issues. So they're catering their business to certain clients, and they have to weigh these various interests. So while it's true that it would be more accurate to get a sampling of 100,000 and 200,000, that's logistically and cost prohibitive, as well as cost prohibitive for many of these outlets. And so what you'll see too, sampling errors, the margin of error, we talked about that before, expressed in plus or minus terms. Ideally, you would want to have as low a sampling error as possible, right? Typically, the best surveys, if you will, or polls, scientific polls, have something around a plus or minus 2 or plus or minus 3. So that's generally the range when you're trying to get a reliable poll. And finally, you take random samples where everyone has equal chance of being included. That's obviously a gold standard in terms of how one would want to conduct an accurate poll. I would recommend, if you have some time, if you were to go to 538.com, 538.com, as if you're spelling out the words 538.com, has really excellent analysis. Nate Silver, who is a statistician and poller for the New York Times for a while, started his own site, and they do some excellent work talking about the reliability of polls. I would strongly suggest for you to go to his site, and you'll find some information about the polls and the reliability of polls. They have a great resource where they actually grade the reliability of polls. Certain polls have A pluses, some have Bs, some have Cs, depending on their predictability, the predictive values, or rather accuracy, predictive accuracy, and their methods and how disciplined their methods are.
And with different types of scientific polls, you have advantages or disadvantages, or different goals that they're trying to achieve. It's something. It is a science, as the name suggests. So the methodology and the best way to get an accurate poll is always changing, and pollsters are always looking for better ways to get accurate results. As Mr. Dowell said earlier, like, would you get a more accurate result by surveying likely voters versus just all voters and things like that? But telephone used to be the main way people would do these scientific polls, using telephones. But with the rise of cell phones, using traditional landlines became more challenging. And so we'll look at some of the limitations of these polls. For example, if you only surveyed people who had a landline nowadays, think about who would likely be oversampled. And you'd have to say, well, it's probably, say, older people who still tend to have, like me, who still tend to have landlines, as opposed to like younger, cooler people like Mr. Davila, who I imagine only uses a cell phone.
He's correct.
And so, you know, in person, you run into some of the same problems. Who's going to be home if you go door to door? You know, maybe it's more likely to be an older person, for example, who might be retired, versus a younger person who probably would be at work. Or if you go to a shopping mall, you know, in-person surveys, even if you randomize it, you have to ask yourself, well, what type of person goes to a shopping mall? And it's going to be a different type of person than someone who doesn't. You know, it's probably someone who has more money, more leisure time, things like that. And so there's a lot of limitations. Exit polling is also fun, you know, and interesting, but it's not always the most accurate form of polling, because you're asking people to fill out a survey as they leave the polling place, thus the name. But you have to make sure you're hitting, you know, enough spots where you're getting accurate results in different parts of the country and different demographics. But you also have the problem of, what if someone refuses to take the poll versus someone who is willing to take the poll? That's going to be a different type of person who has more time or more interest. And then tracking polls are another interesting and useful polling technique that we see, where you track the results of a certain question or issue over time, where you ask the same question, but you track the ups and downs of that poll over time. One of the more famous Gallup polls being the daily tracking poll for presidential approval. Do you approve or disapprove of the job that the president's doing, or something to that effect? And you can see the polls. You can go on their site and you see polls all the way back, I think, to Truman, or around that time, or Eisenhower, and it shows, you know, each president's ups and downs of their approval throughout their term. It's kind of interesting to look at.
So one of the problems with polling, these polls, is something that we haven't mentioned yet, but we're going to now. It's called self-selection bias. Self-selection bias. Please take note of that, because really all polls somewhat suffer from this, because unless you can truly sample everyone in the universe you mean to sample, then you're always going to run into issues with self-selection bias. And what do I mean by that? Yeah, well, in the case, as Mr. Phillips was explaining, and with the people who do in-person surveys at the mall, God bless their souls. I try to avoid them like the plague sometimes. But nonetheless, the point of the matter is that, well, there are going to be plenty of people like myself who choose not to stop and give them my opinion, right? And so the people who do decide to do that, in theory, could be a certain type of persons who perhaps have a lot more leisure time. The same is true with telephones, as Mr. Phillips was mentioning. A self-selection bias, to some extent, is that those who would be willing or able to participate may be people who are older, because they may have more leisure time, or they are the ones who, in fact, even have a landline, whereas other persons like myself only have cell phones. And exit polls, too, suffer from self-selection bias. For example, the persons who are more likely to stop and give their opinion are typically people who are very passionate about one or the other candidate. And so it could misgauge, like it did in 2004, who wins. In some cases, the exit polls were indicating that John Kerry, the Democratic candidate, was on his way to win, when in fact George W. Bush is able to secure a second term. And in part, that would be that the persons perhaps who were voting for John Kerry were much more, if you will, excited or much more motivated or passionate about it than perhaps some of George W. Bush's voters, who perhaps were a little reluctant, given that the Iraq War had already started receiving some criticism at that point in time. The other thing I'll mention with respect to tracking polls is that the ideal tracking poll would want to sample the same group of people over time. And this is typically not possible. One, because the amount of resources and time and effort dedicated to doing as much, again, doesn't necessarily fit with the business model of these various polling outlets. However, this last election, we had a very fortunate situation where the LA Times indeed was able to conduct a more bona fide tracking poll in that they were sampling the same 3,000 or so group of people in terms of their opinions about the presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And ultimately, it's worth noting they were correct in predicting the winner. But it is true, too, though, that you run a risk, even though that you have a more reliable method of gauging fluctuations when you are sampling the same people, right? In theory, if you sample different people, the fluctuation could be attributed to something else, like the amount of certain groups that you got in this sample versus that sample. But in the case of having the same group, you are more accurately detecting fluctuations since we're talking about the same group of people. However, there's also even a little bit of a drawback with that because there's the possibility of having a baked-in bias. In other words, what if your original sampling group is already leaning conservative or already leaning liberal? Then you could have a baked-in bias that is going to distort the outcome and predictive value of the poll.
When we look at polling, one thing that we notice when we look at polling, especially around the time of a presidential election, is we get into this horse race mentality, and that is that or really in general, that what do journalists focus on, and where are all the polls focusing on? That is simply who's winning, who's losing, who's up, who's down, and they don't really get into the deeper issues at stake, like why is someone doing better or worse, or what is someone's particular stance on a certain issue. They don't really go into much depth beyond the surface of simply who's winning and who's losing. And when the media and the public becomes so laser focused on that aspect, we tend to lose sometimes the more important aspects or questions, such as what are the candidates actually, what do they stand for, or what issues are of importance in this election. And often we just we get lost into the details of who's winning, who's losing, which is kind of not very productive.
This seems to be symptomatic of what we see in society in general, is that one of the criticisms has been that political candidates have now started catering their campaigns and whatnot more to the way in which they deliver a message rather than the substance of the message itself, in terms of really trying to dig deep into the consequences or implications of a policy, but rather just focusing on how it's being packaged or the messaging, or does it appeal to a certain group. And this again has consequences for our politics, because we indeed then start selecting people more on whether or not they have a lot of sizzle to them, rather than if there's actually any substance to them. And this is again symptomatic of what one could also characterize as a celebrity-obsessed culture or focus. That's been one of the criticisms that has been cropping up, especially in this last election cycle, but even before then, where we start to see a focus more on how people feel about the candidate's appearance and how they're messaging things, rather than what the message is actually going to mean for these people in their actual lives.
A push poll is another type of question that doesn't actually seek to gauge public opinion, but to shape public opinion by the way the question is asked. And so these are often used by groups that are supporting one candidate or the other. And you see here an example. Would you be more or less likely to support Doug Gearing if you knew he was against ethanol and didn't support farmers, or if you knew that he was under state investigation So you're basically asking a question, and this may or may not even be true. So you might be purposely highlighting a negative aspect of that candidate, or in some cases, you're just maybe stating something that simply isn't true, but you're planting that seed in the voter's mind. Oh, wait, I didn't know that person was under investigation. And so it really doesn't matter how people answer the question. It's more intended to sway people or to plant a seed in their head, a negative seed about that candidate. And you see an actual example that was used during a nasty primary campaign in 2000, in the 2000 Republican primaries between George Bush and John McCain. Bush had lost the initial primary in New Hampshire about a week earlier. And so, Bush was, I guess, actually, this wasn't necessarily tied directly to the Bush campaign, but someone who supported Bush supposedly was asking voters, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for John McCain for president if you knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child? Well, of course, John McCain had not fathered an illegitimate black child, but with voters in South Carolina, and especially you're appealing to sort of the worst side of some of these voters, if they have sort of a racial prejudice or bias, and you're planting that seed in their head, oh, well, maybe John McCain perhaps has an illegitimate black child. And, so it was a ridiculous question, and should be condemned, but unfortunately, this is not uncommon.
In fact, what took place was that John McCain and his wife Cindy had adopted a Bangladeshi girl. What you see with these push polls are distortions and mischaracterizations of things that actually take place. So, for example, they wouldn't say John McCain was seen cavorting with aliens and, shooting lasers out of his eyes. That, of course, is, something rather absurd and would blow back on the persons or campaign that was trying to peddle that kind of absurd theory. So what you'll see is very nefarious, sort of, clever but deceptive tactics where they use and they sort of twist half-truths into what ultimately becomes misleading characterizations to sow seeds of doubt and to paint someone in a negative light.
Notably, Bush did go on to win a victory in South Carolina, which helped, turn his campaign around at that point, which, so sometimes, unfortunately, these things do work.
So stratified sampling is really the best type of sampling that we have today. In terms of the other two types of samplings that we've had, if you recall with quota sampling, we had the issue that it wasn't random, and therefore you ran into issues about subjective bias, about who you thought would in fact turn out, and you could oversample certain groups and undersample others based on your thoughts about who you thought would indeed make up the voting population. Whereas with random sampling, you certainly avoid that sort of subjective bias of the researcher who inserts their predictive a prediction around, about who would turn out, but you run the real risk of oversampling and undersampling by way of your process a certain group and therefore getting an inaccurate representation too. So if you will, the stratified sampling approach sort of blends the virtues of both of the quota and random sampling, and tries to sort of mitigate against the vices of both of those sampling approaches. And so essentially, I'm going to give you an example to sort of help drive this point home. So stratification sampling, the way it would work, let's imagine that a poller is trying to gauge what the country's opinion is about who they prefer for the president. What they would do is they would first sort of divide the country into four quadrants, four regions, let's say northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest, and so on. Or it could be more regions, but for our analogy, for our example, it's enough to just say they divide it up into four. In that sense, you can see that there's the quota sampling sort of factoring in here, right? We're trying to sort of suggest that there's some homogeneous subgroups that we need to sort of identify before we start to randomly sample. But they go a step further typically is what they will do within each region. They'll select a zip code that is perhaps demographically representative of the region at large. So there may be a place, for example, in Colorado, and a zip code in Utah and a zip code in California or Arizona that could accurately sort of give you a predictive value or sense of where that whole region may be going. These would typically be battleground zip codes. In other words, areas where the decision of the election really will come down to these few zip codes. That we'll find a lot of swing voters, voters that could either vote Democratic or Republican, or independent voters in these regions. In other words, these would be the zip codes that everyone's looking at in terms of saying, oh, this is the way in which the presidential election is going to go. So once they've sort of quadranted off the country and then selected a demographically representative zip code, then within those zip codes, they will do random sampling. And so therefore you have both stratification, if you will, both the quota element in that you've divvied up the country into sort of homogeneous subgroups, and then you've also done random sampling within these subgroups. And so you combine the virtues and you mitigate against the vices. And this is, if you will, the best sort of sampling methodology that we have today.
So yes, more difficult to acquire this sample, so therefore I think probably more rare, because you're going to, as Mr. Dobble was mentioning earlier, you're probably going to incur more costs in these types of sampling as opposed to just doing an overall random sample. Another sort of questionable tactic that people use in campaigning is the so-called Robo-Call, and this was used as a push-pull tactic when Obama was running for president, and some people complained that they were receiving these calls on their and getting these messages on their answering machine. And you notice in this case, they were emphasizing apparently Barack Obama's middle name, which is Hussein, and that happens at the time, if you aren't familiar, one of our big enemies from Iraq, or a U.S. sort of a thorn in the side of the U.S. for many years, was a dictator in Iraq named Saddam Hussein. And so they played off this and trying to play off people's fear of the name Barack Hussein Obama, maybe associating him. There was the misleading information that he was a Muslim and all these things like that. So I imagine, I don't know, we don't have the actual recording, although there's a link here. I don't know if that link is still active, but I imagine it was, I'm calling with some important information about Barack Hussein Obama, like the emphasis on Hussein. And at the end, you just can't take a chance on Barack Hussein Obama, saying in that sort of, evil voice that they use on these ads and things like that. I guess there was an effort to cut back on robocalls that I think has only been maybe minimally successful because people are still receiving them.
Pardon the announcement over the intercom, but essentially, as Mr. Phillips was talking about, that these robocalls unfortunately still happen, perhaps not as with much frequency, but they still are able to get through. These polls that follow, for example, the LA Times poll on abortion versus the CBS News poll on abortion, what is that meant to show you? So it's interesting because polls, the way in which they ask a question can often dictate the outcome. So you can see here on the issue of abortion, the way in which they ask the question, but also the options they give you to respond to the question can greatly, if you will, change the sort of impression that one gets about the support or non-support or lack of support, if you will, for a particular issue. So it's very important to pay close attention to not just the poll question, but also the options made available to you to respond to the poll question as well.
This is a good example of a tracking poll. They're saying, do you approve or disapprove? This is what we were talking about earlier with the presidential tracking poll. Do you approve or disapprove of the job that Barack Obama is doing as president. And you see, his numbers fluctuating over time from approve and disapprove. But, again, this is a tracking poll, which can be useful. You see the ups and downs, but, it has limited usefulness in the sense that things can change relatively quickly over time. Or, you see this was just over, from early in 2009, by the end to the end of 2009, his numbers had dropped. Of course, by the end of his presidency, he was back up near 60% approval. So, people are a bit fickle sometimes when it comes to these questions. And this is another interesting poll just showing, where presidents' approval ratings were in January of their third year as president. So basically about halfway through their presidency. And then, think about where some of these presidents ended up. Did they end up getting reelected? And you see, like with George W. Bush, 60% approval versus his father, George H.W. Bush, who had 75% approval at that point. But which one of those Bushes actually ended up being reelected? It was George W. Bush. And so, these, again, tracking polls have limited usefulness because things can change fairly quickly. Ronald Reagan, you see, was at 36% approval, yet he went on to win one of the biggest landslide re-election victories in 1984 in history.
So you can see here that different choices can lead to different results. And so you can see whether or not you ask someone if they agree or disagree. The kind of binary choice may force certain outcomes. In this way, you may have people who feel ambivalent or ambiguous about certain things, but when you force them to indicate a preference for something and they have no other option, or the degree to which they have a preference, so strongly agree versus just agree, or strongly disagree versus just disagree, you can have distorted results as well. And you may force people to indicate a preference for something that they may have very lukewarm or very ambivalent feelings about. There's value to this, but there's also drawbacks from it, right? And that the drawback is that you may overplay or overstate the level of support that you may have, or agreement you may have, or disagreement that exists for a particular issue. But the benefit of this, in part, would be to suggest that, well, when push comes to shove, when it comes to electing a person or a candidate, there are going to be, two options usually, and you have to decide which one are you ultimately going to, go with. But again, it sometimes, and it oftentimes could misrepresent the degree to which, or the level at which someone supports a particular issue or person.
And this at the end here is just kind of a fun comparison. If you just have segment A and segment B, or we don't exactly know who these people are, right? And they ask them questions, about their party affiliation, and you can see going on here that how often do you vote, and you start to see a lot of similarities between these two groups. So who are these two groups? And it turns out, if you look through the results, that one, I believe, the general population, and the other is people who drink Bud Light.
Bud Light, yeah. So essentially what happened was that there was a an issue that had a racial component that flared up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where Harvard's located. A famous professor there who is African American was, someone called the police on him, and you can see the gentleman here on the right next to Barack Obama was the responding officer, and there was a flare-up as to the way in which the officer treated the professor, and sort of...
Because I think he was trying to get into his home, and one of the neighbors or someone driving by thought he was trying to break into the home.
Right, and this sort of, again, these are issues that we're still grappling with today in terms of, communities that have difficulties with trust or trust issues, perhaps with the police departments and so on. And in either event, it was asked of Barack Obama to weigh in on this. Especially, there was a particular sort of insistence that he did, since he was the first African American president of the United States. And so, of course, there was never going to be a perfect, siding for one or the other, persons in this situation, because it would obviously alienate one group. So in other words, you were stuck between a rock and a hard place. Instead, Barack Obama said, let's talk it out over beer. It was called the Beer Summit, if you will. And so as to demonstrate to the country that these kind of issues require dialogue and discourse, as opposed to jumping to conclusions and just immediately siding, that there has to be some level of rapport that is established in order to have greater understanding. However, Barack Obama's detractors, those who opposed him, this just shows you a silly example of how people can distort polls in such ways for their own political objectives or motives. And in this case, they were saying that Barack Obama was purposely using Bud Light as a proxy for the regular voter, because when we look at the A and B categories, let me turn the slide here, you'll notice that there is a very close parallel between those who drink Bud Light and, frankly, where most of the sort of voters are in the country, in terms of there's a very good, if you will, comparison here. So in either event, what it goes to show you, what we want to sort of leave you with here, is that polling, public opinion and polling, are very important facets of the political science process in terms of better understanding where people may be on issues and how the government should respond and what kind of areas need to be addressed because people are indeed expressing a grievance, but that we should also be aware of the pitfalls, that these polls can sometimes be manipulated, they can sometimes misrepresent, or we may read too much into them, and we need to caution, or rather restrain ourselves in terms of how much we wish to read into them, which oftentimes project more our biases than what the polls are actually telling us.
And that's just, again, it goes through the same numbers, but shows you one was the U.S. population over 21 as a whole, and the other one was Bud Light drinkers over 21. So, playing into that idea that they are pretty representative. Bud Light drinkers are pretty representative of America.